Senator Charles Carroll of Carrollton owned more than 10,000 acres of land and 300 enslaved men, women, and children when he affixed his name to the Declaration of Independence. The preamble stating, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Generations later, Charles Carroll's great-grandson, also named Charles Carroll, still held people in bondage, denying them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Among them was John Connor. He was born in 1845 in Maryland and legally considered the property of Charles Carroll. He fled from the Carroll estate and enlisted in June 1863 with another man from the Carroll property named Henry Hart. Connor was dark-skinned, 18 years old, 5'4.5" inches, with black eyes and hair, and with a scar between his eyes when he enlisted at Mason's Island, Virginia. The island, located in the middle of the Potomac River, served as a training camp for the 1st United States Colored Infantry. He fought in the Battle of Fort Pocahontas in nearby Charles City County on May 24, 1864, helping to defeat Robert E. Lee's nephew's cavalry. On June 15, 1864, he helped break through the initial defenses at Petersburg. Ultimately, he with his regiment shifted to North Carolina and participated in the Battle of Forks Road in February 1865. During this time, he reportedly said that he was cold and had, quote, severe pains in the small of his back and had great difficulty in making water. This was symptomatic of chronic nephritis and edema. After the war, he and Susan Sherwood had a child named Mary in 1871, and Susan and John married in 1878. A son was born to them in 1881, named John. John Sr.'s ailments combined with rheumatism ultimately ended his life when he was only 41 years old in 1886. His widow applied for a pension in 1889, but she was rejected as a doctor said her husband's illness was not related to his wartime service. Her second application for a pension, filed in 1892, Henry Hart testified on behalf of his fallen comrade, revealing that he had known Susan's husband since they were boys. He said his proper name was John Connor. He bore that name prior to the war. He enlisted and served under the name Robert Sitterman. In fact, Henry Hart had changed his name to Henry Stoneman and never changed it back. Henry explains why this change. "We changed our names at the same time at enlistment and done so because we were afraid if we were captured, we could be returned to our former master. John and Henry were rightful to be afraid of being returned. Their enlistment was a threat to John and Henry and all U.S. colored troops." On May 1st, 1863, while Confederate troops fought what was ultimately considered Robert E. Lee's greatest victory at Chancellorsville, the Confederate Congress, just up the hill at the Virginia state capitol, not the one that everyone thinks is the state capitol, but the one that's actually the state capitol, passed a new bill. It said white officers leading black troops in conflict against the Confederates would be put to death if captured or otherwise punished. Importantly for John Connor, they said, "All Negroes and mulattoes who shall be engaged in war shall, when captured, be delivered to the authority of the state or states in which they shall be captured, and dealt with according to the laws of that state." But the when captured left the door open to it not happening. Susan Connor ultimately secured her pension, in part due to the testimony of Henry Stoneman, aka Henry Hart, and other soldiers. She died in 1927. On June 23, 1847, Henry Hatton handed over $100, thereby securing the final element of his quest to secure the ownership of an enslaved child named George. Henry, then 36, worked hard as a blacksmith over the last several years and had purchased two other enslaved children, Henry and Martha. But this was not the work of some creative working class white man who was seeking to move up in Maryland slaveholding culture. Rather, Henry Hatton and his wife Margaret were a married mixed-race couple. Henry and Margaret were the parents of these three children, and Henry secured the next best thing to freedom for a Black father in a slaveholding society: ownership of his children. They gained skills, including how to read and write. A decade after Henry Sr. purchased his last child away from a white slave owner, he must have been simultaneously incensed and relieved he had done so. The United States Supreme Court ruled that Dred and Harriet Scott, who were suing for their freedom, could not do so. The judgment's most stinging element was that persons of African descent had never been intended by the founders of the United States to be citizens, and the Chief Justice of the court went so far as to say that people like the Hattons, people who looked like me and some of you, had no rights that white men were bound to respect. It went further to say that the property clause was only applicable to lands possessed in 1787 when the Constitution was ratified, and so Congress could not ban slavery in territories acquired since. Lastly, the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment prohibited the federal government from freeing enslaved people brought into federal territories. For the Hattons, it must have seemed that they were going deeper into a perpetual slave society. By 1860, they were living in Prince George's County, Maryland. The family kept a secret that Henry Sr. technically owned his children, as they were recorded as free people in the 1850 and 1860 census. By April of 1862, things were changing due to the Civil War. That month, Congress passed and Abraham Lincoln signed into law an Emancipation Act for Washington, D.C. residents. Now, Henry Sr. had a chance to change his children's lives forever. He freed them on May 6, 1862. Martha was 24 and described as being mulatto and of medium height. Brother Henry Jr. was 22, dark, tall, and stout. George, then 19, mulatto, medium height, and stout. Henry Sr. stated Martha was an excellent seamstress. Henry Jr. was a good blacksmith, and George an excellent servant. They were all crucial on their parents' farm as well. However, George would trade in city life and farm work for war. On June 8, 1863, George Hatton mustered in alongside his brother on Mason's Island, Virginia, in the 1st United States Colored Infantry. He was described in slightly more detail: 5'6", dark mulatto, with black hair and black eyes and missing a front tooth. 11 months later, Sergeant Hatton was with his regiment manning Fort Pocahontas. On May 10, 1864, Hatton describes how those once enslaved turned against the man who once owned and mistreated Black people. The 1st U.S. Colored Infantry was out foraging when they captured William Clopton, then in his mid-50s and a neighbor of the widowed former First Lady Julia Gardner Tyler, now pro-secessionist. Hatton wrote, "On the day before we captured several colored women that belonged to Mr. C, who had given them a most unmerciful whipping before their departure. On the arrival of Mr. C in camp, the commanding officer determined to let the women have their revenge and ordered Mr. C to be tied to a tree in front of headquarters. And William Harris, a soldier in our regiment and a member of Company E who was acquainted with the gentleman and who used to belong to him, was called upon to undress him and introduce him to the ladies that I mentioned before. Mr. Harris played his part conspicuously, bringing the blood from his loins at every stroke, and not forgetting to remind the gentleman of the days gone by. After giving him some 15 or 20 well-directed strokes, the ladies, one after another, came up and gave him a like number to remind him that they were no longer his, but safely housed in Abraham's bosom, and under the protection of the Star-Spangled Banner, and guarded by their own patriotic, though once downtrodden race. Oh, that I had the tongue to express my feelings while standing upon the banks of the James River on the soil of Virginia, the mother state of slavery, as a witness to such a sudden reverse. The day is clear. The fields of grain are beautiful, and the birds are singing sweet melodious songs, while poor Mr. C is crying to his servants for mercy. Let all who sympathize with the South take this narrative for a mirror. Days later, Hatton and his brother in the 1st U.S. Colored Infantry defeated the Confederates at Fort Pocahontas, 4 days after he was promoted to first sergeant. On June 15, 1864, when his regiment attacked Confederate defenders in their earthworks east of Petersburg, George was shot near the knee and was compelled to stop. Treated initially at a regimental hospital, he was moved to City Point, now Hopewell, and then by boat to the Hampton Hospital at Fort Monroe within 5 days. Sergeant Hatton wrote to his father about his wound and his desire for his dad to visit and hopefully take him home, where George said, "I should have the attendance of my kind and loving mother." Henry Sr. arrived at Fort Monroe on June 30th, where his son was excited to see him. But Henry Sr. was greeted by a rude doctor who directed the father to another physician. That man did not allow Henry to take his son home on furlough. George said he was willing to deal with that and the unequal pay he received in 1863 and thus far in 1864, but he discovered a white man to come to get his son out on furlough, and the physician allowed the white soldier to go. Hatton recorded his dismay at this display of racism when he wrote, "Such deceptions as that I thought was crucified at the Battle of Fort Wagner, buried at Milliken's Bend, rose the third day and descended into everlasting forgetfulness in the Appomattox River at the Battle of Petersburg. Mr. Editor, when, oh when, can one of my color and in my position at this time find a comforter? When will my people be a nation? I fear never on the American soil, though we may crush this cursed rebellion." Sergeant Hatton recovered from his wound and returned to the regiment in late November of 1864. He and his brother Henry fought in the Battle of Forks Road. George took ill in mid-March 1865 and was discharged for disability on June 16, 1865. He returned to Washington, married a woman named Frances. In 1869, he became a member of the District of Columbia's Common Council. He traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as so many tourists interested in the Civil War have and continue to do. He joined the mayor, board of aldermen, and the Common Council in Gettysburg for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Monument at the National Cemetery. En route, the mayor and most of the other white city officials, minus one, encouraged Hatton to be treated in a so-called separate but equal manner in Baltimore. Hatton, irritated, but agreed to it, though he ended up dining in relative peace. Upon arrival in Gettysburg and moving to the DC government's lodging outside of town, Hatton and white councilman James Holmes sat to dine in the dining room at the hotel. The mayor attempted to get Councilman Hatton to not even stay in the hotel and provided $6 to him to find other lodging. George Hatton resisted, and the mayor and most of the city's leaders, quote, reluctantly agreed that they would insist on my having the same accommodations as the other persons in the party, and that the whole party would breakfast together the next morning. After discussion with the senator also staying in the hotel about what was happening, George found out from him that another member of the DC government had given up the room that had been assigned to me and that my name had been erased from the hotel register. The hotel owner quickly got Haddon and James Holmes a large and handsomely furnished room for the remainder of their stay. Councilman Haddon noted that he was given equal seating to the other members of the DC delegation, but during Senator Oliver P. Morton's speech, most of the DC council walked away. Haddon believed this discourteous move was made by these officials to avoid dining together with me in Gettysburg. Haddon must have thought back to his 1864 letter when he questioned, when can one of my color and in my position find a comforter? John Connor and ultimately Reverend George Haddon served this nation. They were people who believed in an America that could be different from the one that they were born into. These ordinary men boldly defended a nation which codified slavery at local, state, and national levels of government. In their different methods of becoming emancipated, they chose to serve under the United States flag to change the United States. They were liberated, were liberators, were soldiers, were husbands, and were fathers. They were and remain as fundamental to shaping our America as Charles Carroll of Carrollton. It is up to us to resist allowing them and their families' experiences from being pushed into the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for those very intimate looks at the Hattons and Connor. And now for our next presenter, we've got Dr. Holly Pinheiro, Jr. He is an assistant professor of African American history in the Department of History at Furman University. His research focuses on the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the military from 1850 to the 1930s. And his book, The Family Civil War, Northern African American Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, explores how racism in and outside of the military service impacted African Americans long after the war ended. And I do want to mention that we have Dr. Pinheiro's book on order. It is a print-on-demand book, so it took a little longer to get here than we expected. But if you are interested after the program in purchasing the book, we're taking advance orders, and we have book plates that Holly can sign for you. So keep that in mind. But let's give Dr. Holly Pinheiro a warm welcome.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Emmanuel, for starting us off with that powerful presentation. All right. Even before the Civil War began, African Americans were fighting for racial and social equality. Often, historians focus on the lived experiences of African Americans residing in southern states to understand how African Americans fought to reframe society to become more inclusive. But it is vital that we also acknowledge the complexities and experiences of Northern African Americans as well. And discussing societal racism beyond the South furthers that anti-Blackness was never isolated to one region. Even in states where slavery was officially and eventually abolished, racism would continue to evolve. Pennsylvania, while not representative of the North, was an example of a northern state that sought to normalize and codify white supremacy. There is, of course, a difference between being opposed to slavery and being for racial equality. Pennsylvania demonstrates that African Americans faced attempts to restrict them even when they were not enslaved for decades. But going before that, in May of 1838, when Philadelphian anti-abolitionists would burn to the ground what was called Pennsylvania Hall, which was supposed to be this temple of free discussion where a diverse collection of abolitionists and women's rights activists congregated. Anti-abolitionists then burned African American homes, religious institutions, but also schools and businesses as they violently expressed their racist views. And to be clear, in the aftermath of that, the local police force arrested the local black community, and in the newspaper openly stated, it's all your fault to begin with. To be clear, this was neither the first or sadly the last white-led race riot, but truly race massacre in Philadelphia. That same year, the state legislature revised the definition of freedom to be exclusively white and male, and it explicitly both racialized and gendered voting rights, which continued until the passage of the 15th and 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. By the fall, voters who were predominantly white men approved the new state constitution. Thus, it was evident that many white Pennsylvanians did not believe in racial equality at that time. Now, for the Rothwell family, who were African Americans living about 19 miles south of Philadelphia, 1838 was a memorable year for them, more specifically because of the birth of Alfred, who will be a future Civil War soldier in the 3rd United States Colored Infantry, or USCI. Now, due to the actions beyond their control, including birth, Alfred lived in a state that demonstrated hostility, sometimes violently, towards African Americans. And he, like many others, would spend his life battling racism while just trying to live on a day-to-day basis. By the fall of 1847, life for Black Pennsylvanians dramatically changed after the state legislature decided, for various reasons, to formally ban slavery. African Americans undoubtedly celebrated this new policy, primarily because it provided more opportunities for them to engage in human rights activism. For Isaac Rothwell Sr., Alfred's father, the humanitarian and grassroots social activism that he did connected to, as a descendant noted, quote, using his sailing expertise to hide Blacks seeking freedom, end quote. Now, perhaps Alfred continued this path as he worked as a fisherman before he enlisted. The efforts to protect African Americans who fled from their enslavers dramatically increased after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This revised federal law simultaneously protected the rights of enslavers to their human property, while making any African Americans, but truly any Black person, sometimes with baseless claims or kidnapping, a potential victim who rarely, if ever, was allowed to testify on their behalf. And I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Hillary Green at Davidson College, who's got a new book on the horizon that's going to be talking about this explicitly in her family history. And we need to talk more about the family consequences of slavery and freedom. Additionally, the federal policy strengthened its punishments for those found in violation of not enforcing the law, including exorbitant fines and a lengthy jail sentence. Thus, the Rothwell family's activism was critical in saving lives while directly opposing this racist federal law. It is also essential, I believe, to recognize that the employment on northern waterways was an anomaly for many Pennsylvania African Americans. Philadelphia, for instance, was a city where many African Americans found it extremely difficult to find any work beyond unskilled labor. Historian and super scholar, in my opinion, W.E.B. Du Bois stated that, quote, everyone knows in a city like Philadelphia that a Negro does not have the same chance to exercise his ability or secure work according to his talents as a white man, end quote. Looking northward toward New York City, white employers and customers used numerous methods to limit employment opportunities for African Americans. Thus, Northern African Americans working semi or skilled occupations resisted occupational racial discrimination daily. Alfred still was able to create a meaningful life, and he married Elizabeth Harris in 1857. Between 1858 and 1862, the couple would have 3 children, James, Isaac, and Hannah. Life for the growing family was difficult for numerous reasons as they tried to survive while combating racism. But little did their family know that their lives would forever change when the Civil War began. In the years leading up to the mobilization of USCT regiments, many white people, including numerous Northerners, questioned if African Americans would make good soldiers because they supposedly lacked courage. Their flawed assertion ignored that African Americans demonstrated bravery every day. Men, women, children, everyone, as they battled against white supremacy. Furthermore, any person questioning the willingness of African American men to serve in the US military ignored the fact that Black men served in the United States Navy long before. Now, in terms of USCT recruits, they were a diverse group with a legion of reasons to become US Army soldiers. Some African American men, for example, soldiered in order to allow them to simultaneously refute denigrations of their manhood while making public demands for full and equal citizenship on the national level. Others desired to engage in armed combat to destroy slavery. Some needed the one-time cash injections that some enlisted men could amass throughout the enlistment process, though that was really tricky. Unfortunately, the enlistment records rarely reveal what motivated young men such as the Rothwell men, which was Alfred, Isaac Jr., and Samuel, along with their friend George Potts, who all enlisted in the 3rd USCI in July of 1863. Regardless of their motivations, their actions had the potential to impact the families as well. And for the Rothwells and Potts, they were now people with personal connections to Pennsylvania's first of 11 USCT regiments. Now, for the families and their larger community, they were critical supporters to the war effort, and numerous war propagandists knew that as well. African American women, more specifically, received frequent public praise from a racially diverse group of Northerners for their prominent role in getting able-bodied men to enlist. One example is Pennsylvania Congressman William D. Kelly, who proclaimed that African American mothers, such as Elizabeth Pell and Sarah Potts, but also wives such as Elizabeth Rothwell, were vital to the war effort. The Weekly Anglo-African, meanwhile, was a newspaper publishing out of New York City, printed similar statements in widely circulated newspaper articles. For Alfred's own family, his enlistment disrupted their already destabilized family economy, since he was the family's only documented, and that is important, full-time wage earner for the family. And his July 4th, 1863 enlistment immediately ended his civilian wages. He also never received his $100 enlistment bounty due for his service. Additionally, throughout his military career, he received $7 monthly due to U.S. War Department policies. At the same time, white soldiers of the same rank in the same army, sometimes doing the same work, were making $13 monthly. Not only was his life cheapened, but it had a direct impact on Alfred's wife and children, who desperately needed that money in order to survive. In incorporating the materialities of Northern African American families when discussing the consequences of soldiering, I believe ultimately provides more depth and better uncovers the complexities of family life in and outside of the military. Now, in terms of the training process, it was complex. And for many enlisted men and their kin, the forced familial separation did not cease them from seeking to remain close and connected to each other throughout the process. For Northern African American women, such as Emily Davis, visiting and supporting USCT soldiers was a priority, but not solely for the spectacle of seeing African American men in U.S. Army uniform. In many instances, African Americans used various forms of public transit, sometimes placing themselves in volatile and life-threatening situations as they tried to support the men while training. Now, Northern African American women's U.S. Army camp visits were well known in places like Iowa, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, just to name a few. For instance, Mary Leeton, the wife of Benjamin Davis, brought her infant son Jerome to Camp William Penn to spend time together. Little did that young family know that it would be the last time they would ever all be together, because unfortunately Benjamin would die as a prisoner of war later that year. And in fact, it was Mary's diligence to bring Jerome to Camp William Penn that was the only reason, according to the record, that Jerome got a miner's pension. So we need to put more respect on women like her and their commitment to their families, in my opinion. Now, however, raising multiple children alone made it difficult for women like Elizabeth Rothwell possibly to go to camp, because records do not have her there. Now, for the Rothwell family, unfortunately, everything changed for them on August 26th of 1863. As part of the 3rd USCI siege on Fort Wagner at Morris Island in South Carolina, Alfred was killed while digging a trench. Thomas Rockhold, as first sergeant in the 3rd USCI, spoke to Alfred as he said his last words. According to Rockhold, Alfred proclaimed, quote, "Goodbye, dear wife. Please don't grieve for me, because I died for a good cause," end quote. Assuming that Alfred's last words were true, then it meant that he wanted to assure his kin that he had what some historians refer to as the good death. In short, dying service members expressed their adoration for the relatives or partner or community before dying. And it is important to note that the good death at its core was meant to provide solace to grieving individuals who could theoretically take pride in the symbolic, meaningful sacrifices. And while it is certainly understandable why people on the home front would want, arguably need that kind of information, the fact remains that their family members and community members were dead. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, she was now a widow raising 3 children by herself. Immediately following the tragic news, Elizabeth successfully received a widow's pension of $8 per month. The money was undoubtedly a welcome addition to her household, but it would never replace Alfred. Like countless other Civil War widow pensioners, Elizabeth, receiving the money also meant that she, per congressional laws, stipulated that she must remain celibate and avoid acting, quote, in a manner unbecoming of a woman, end quote, for the remainder of her life, if she hoped to continue as a pensioner if she was a widow. We don't talk enough about that. That's a whole nother conversation. Otherwise, she would have lost her pension and possibly faced jail time for pension fraud. And unfortunately, I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A. That happened more than, at least from what I've seen, more than I ever thought possible. In short, widows' pensions through federal policies and oversight sought to control women's private and intimate lives. Now, she did not apply for her children to receive minors' pensions, even though they could have received them in 1863 for unknown reasons. Now, even though politicians and federal government agencies attempted to control Elizabeth's life, she made decisions that gave her agency. And in 1868, she would wed Robert Anderson, who was also a USCT veteran, demonstrating that she lived on her terms. It also meant that after getting married, she would lose her widow's pension, as stipulated through the pension law. Now, perhaps in response to these changes to their family size and finances, motivated the Rothwell children, under Elizabeth's guidance, to apply for minors' pensions, which all 3 children had approved. Each pension of $8 monthly continued until each child turned 16 years old, with Hannah's being the last one in 1878. Their collective's minors' pensions illustrate, I believe, that Elizabeth remained committed to the best of her abilities to ensuring some financial stability for her family, even in the face of unending racial and gender discrimination. And her commitment to her family was apparent in that her children graduated from the Soldiers' Orphan School in Pennsylvania. In fact, Isaac and James Rothwell were so proud of their scholastic endeavors that they shared their diplomas with the Bureau of Pensions in 1916. Unfortunately, in 1919, Elizabeth died. She left behind a legacy of fighting for racial and gender discrimination. Her life is so inspiring that one of her descendants, Michelle Marsden, conducted years' worth of self-funded familial research that took them to numerous archives as they sought to learn more about their ancestors. Conducting this personal research was difficult and time-consuming, but their commitment to reclaiming the histories of their kin kept them going. A few months ago, I had the honor and the privilege of interviewing Michelle because I wanted to get her thoughts on why we, as scholars, should examine people like her relatives in addition to more prominent individuals. To be clear, there is no question that examining famous and well-documented historical figures is more manageable, especially when trying to provide an easy starting point. Nevertheless, by overlooking lesser-known or even undocumented historical figures, we do harm to United States history, or history more broadly. Furthermore, by centering on the lives of people like the Rothwell family, we can have a deeper appreciation of how African American families were fundamental in reframing society as they supported each other. And I will just close with, this is actually the link to this interview, and I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A, but I'll just say this. This book won an award, and it did very well, and I'm very happy with that, but to be honest, other than my baby, and the book, obviously, this interview, and her approval, because I think back to when I was struggling and truthfully thought nobody cared about what I do. Because there were a lot of people who would say, no one's gonna care about your book. I heard that a lot. And so it hurt. And I asked her, I did a presentation like this, and she was in the audience. She said, I think you're talking about one of my relatives. I was like, yeah, right, sure. Right. Turns out it was. And I say that because she said things that I never disclosed in the book, because there was many things that we just don't have the time or space to do. And she was like, oh, the kids went here and they did this. And I was like, oh, word. Either you really know them or you're just like, so I was like, you are the descendant. And I asked her, I said, please read the book. And I want to know, what do you think? Because when I was in grad school, what I wanted more than anything else was the approval of these families. They're not my families, I want to be clear. But I've been studying them for over a decade. And to me, it's like, they're with me. I have my job because of them. I recognize that. And she read the book and she sent me an email. I've already started crying, so whatever. Sorry, this is what I do. Thank you. She sent me an email and she said, Holly, thank you for acknowledging Elizabeth. Thank you for seeing her. And I don't speak for her, I speak with her. And that means everything to me. So I'll just say, like, I do this work and I'm like, what Emmanuel does, it's very important. So thank you for this.
So I think my first question to you is, what spurred your interest and what prompted you to research these men? And then how has it helped to broaden your understanding of the USCT experience?
Okay, all right. So what inspired me has been a lifelong love of history. Today, I was away this weekend at a friend's wedding, and so I missed the news. And I got in the car today, and it'll connect that. My first acknowledged love of history was Titanic. And now I hear that there are 5 missing people on a Titanic expedition. And while I recognize that as a starting point, I really think it was my beloved granny. And I know that some people in this room have heard me talk about granny until the cows come home. And we keep talking about it. But that sort of family history was always there. I grew up near Petersburg National Battlefield. And not that I've been able to document a U.S. colored soldier yet in my family. When I was a kid and I didn't get to become the mutant superhero I wanted to be, and I was 16, my mom was like, yep, time to get a job. So I started working at Petersburg National Battlefield, and I've been there 22 years now. And I remember when I first got there, looking at what are the stories that we're sort of highlighting, talking about, and we had white Civil War soldier kind of down. We knew who they were. There's plenty more work to be done about white Civil War soldiers, plenty more work, but we had the big idea. There was less work about U.S. colored troops. There had only, in 1993, had the park gotten a monument for U.S. colored troops. And those stories were kind of not very present in our media, not in our museum exhibits, not in our, at the time we had a digital map program. And so someone gave me a piece of advice that I took. It was find something that no one else is doing and do it better than anyone else is. And so I started as a temporary employee, a seasonal employee. So I was supposed to have been there summer of 2001. And she said, if you do it well enough, they won't get rid of you. And so they have not gotten rid of me. Sometimes they probably wish they could. But that's really it. It was why are we not doing this? Unbeknownst to me, the National Park Service had a sort of push from ex-Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. to start telling the story of Black people at our parks. I had no idea what was going on. It was just me as a Black teenager coming into this park as an employee saying, where are the Black people? Why are we have plantation sites. We have, U.S. Code Group history? Where is it?
Well, Holly, what about you?
All right. So I think part of it is like, I'm a military brat, right? So I was actually born in Norfolk. And then when I was 6 months old, we got deployed to Melbourne, Australia. So I actually had an accent until I was a teenager. English is a second, trust me, it doesn't make sense. But like, so like moving to Greenville is the 30th place in the world that I've lived. And my mother retired right after Desert Storm, right? And so when I was a kid, every year I was going to a new elementary in a new state. And it was because my mother was a single woman raising 3 children by herself. And so basically the family agreed, we're just gonna split the kids up amongst the family every time she gets deployed. So that way we know. And it was fine. I mean, obviously I was loved and all that, but as a kid, I love my mom, all right? That's important because what I'm about to say, you're like, whoa. As a kid, I genuinely was so angry at my mother because I felt that she loved the United States and the military more than her children. Now as an adult, I understand things differently, but it was very difficult. And then when she retired, I saw my mother unemployed for a long time, working 10 jobs and battling with, just get access to a doctor. So when someone says thank you for your service, that's not enough to me. That's hollow, because it's not taking into account my grandmother crying, me crying, my brother like acting out because we're like, is she alive? Right, we see there's a bombing and she's stationed right off the coast there. And so for me, it's like, what about our struggles too? And I say all that to say that, going back to my research, I've seen Glory way too many times, right? Like, and that was probably one of the first, and to be clear, we need another movie. We need more, we need a miniseries, we need more. We need more content. That is not the only USCT story to be told. And it's sad that it is essentially one of, if not the only. And for me, it was just like, I wanted to really look at someone, Morgan Freeman. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. I'm kind of surprised if you, but like there's a scene, the campfire scene, which I always lose it. Like I'm gonna start bawling when that happens. And Morgan Freeman says, I think he's something to the effect of, I left my kinfolk in Bundy. Like every time I hear that, I think, what about them? What about them too? Because they matter just as much. And so for me, I bring my understanding of the military as a child of someone who served into my research and trying to incorporate not just the men, their wives, their children, but also who were those soldiers as kids? Because my mom is not a veteran. She's my mom, first and foremost. I'm more interested in her as a young woman than I was her in service, because the stories I heard there, wait, what? And so for me, it's like bringing all that, bringing in her family and her community is part of the story. And if all we do is focus on the men in uniform, we're not telling accurate history.
Thank you for that. And you both kind of talked about discrimination that these individuals faced before, during, and after the war, really. And when we think about their sacrifices and what they endured, what were they able to accomplish in spite of the discrimination that they were faced with? What would you like to say about that, kind of when we think about the fight against slavery and also for racial equality? Did their sacrifices mean anything?
So I think, I think one thing is like how we talk about not just Black history, women's history, different history of those who've been marginalized. They're never, in my opinion, oppressed. We can look at the record of someone who was enslaved and see agency in every different form, not just physical, right? It could be not responding. It could be breaking something. But I think like that to me is, we need to flip the conversation to not look at Black history, for example, as being oppressed. Because for me as a young child, that's why I was initially not as interested in going to museums, truthfully. Because I wasn't getting the history I was hearing from my family or different community members. So I think how we talk about people's history to empower them to know that their history, your voices matter. I had the privilege of presenting at one of the national park sites, Camp Nelson in Kentucky, and a USCT descendant there said to me, why aren't more historians talking like you do about our history? And I said, firstly, there are, and there are people who are out there in the front lines, arguably like doing very important work, but we need to normalize the important things that are happening and just like bring that to the conversation, because I'll throw another, Natchez, Mississippi. They apparently, and I've had the privilege of learning more about their history, they speculate, and this is in conjunction with the local government there, that over 50% of the Black population there are the direct descendants of Black Civil War soldiers. And I was upset that I just found that out during my visit there. And so it's like, there's so much great history out there that we could do a better job of illuminating and empowering and getting people to understand history. We could do a better job of incorporating all the voices to tell it the way it was lived, not the way we want it to be told.
I mean, I feel like the George Hatton narrative, in that he did some things that, had he remained with the white slaveholder, may not have happened the way, like the learning to read and write, unlikely that his white owner would have allowed that, even though there was not a specific law in Maryland, unlike many other slave-based states, prohibiting it. It was discouraged. His post-war life of marrying a woman that he wants and having the amount of children that he and she were able to and wanted to. There's no more risk by 1866 when they married for them to be bought and sold. They're, keeping that feeling connection together with his parents and his own family. He became the first Black member of DC Common Council. At the time, DC's government was like 3 parts, but he's the first Black elected official, and now one of the, still on the verge of, and hopefully we will keep a very Black city there. We won't turn off the go-go music. But George should get the experience go-go. That's a mistake. It's timing. But he became a newspaper editor. He became a AME minister, and he struggled. I mean, he moved around. He attempted to commit suicide in the 1890s. He was not successful at that, and seems to have recovered from that dark period of his life. And he moved out to Kentucky, and he moved back to Maryland. So these are things that he is controlling, he is deciding with a conversation, and who knows, maybe sometimes they were heated, maybe sometimes they were not, with his wife and children about what they were going to sort of collectively do. And so while there were these struggles, there were these moments where racism really, slapped him in the face, he found those ways to eke out and craft the life that he wanted.
So these are really stories of resilience that need to be told.
Right.
And on that, how are we doing with telling the story? And could each of you speak to how you've seen things change with the NPS, how things have changed in academia?
The NPS, we still got some work to do.
There has been a remarkable amount of change. Like, I can say that I no longer feel completely isolated. The internet helps. So you can see what other places are doing easily versus, being at home as a teenager and like, oh, I went to work and I did what I thought was a great job that day. It's like, is anyone else out there? And now I know there are other people out there. They are white, they are Black, they are older, they are younger. But we sometimes struggle to convey that when visitors come in. It may be in a book that we have, it may be on a wayside, but sometimes when we're actually, I don't do this as much anymore, but when we're having face-to-face conversations with the public, we sometimes fall back on the big house, white people, family story, and we forget that there are all these other people that are making that place operate. We forget that some of those people left these places and served in the U.S. military. The William Clopton story of him being whipped by his formerly enslaved man, William Harris, and these women. The women are whipping him naked in a way that he used to whip them half naked. Is an interesting and would have been a dramatic moment that is happening down the road from President John Tyler's Sherwood Forest, where for a long time it just sort of was like John and Julia Tyler were these nice white people who had a bunch of kids and they lived surrounded by magnolias and everything was just great. Fortunately, one of the Tyler descendants now is like engaged in researching these people, and she's found, people who left the Sherwood Forest and enlisted in the U.S. military. And so these connections, I feel like, between the past, they sometimes don't come out, but they are getting out there more than they used to.
I think, and from my experience, we have a long way to go. I struggle with, and I'm speaking in academia, I want to be clear, like the tokenization of Black history. For instance, I usually get called when, we need a Black speaker, right? Like, not we need a scholar who happens to do this and is Black, right? So I'm more than my race, firstly. But then also for me, I struggle with academics who talk about, for instance, or when we're talking about military service and Black men, we put it on this pedestal. And we don't talk about the realities of their experiences, and we often ignore whom is around them and supporting them. We only talk about that person in the blue suit. But what about their families, right? Because having the privilege of doing presentations in collaboration with some NPS sites, I'm learning a lot more about the community demands to be heard. Like that's where my passions are right now, is to really engage with communities. I used to think it was about this, and that's not fulfilling to me in the same way of someone saying, thank you for telling me to conduct this work because it matters. Because it does matter. Your history matters. And if that's what it takes is me using my privilege to say that to you, then I'll do it. And I think that that's something as academics we could do a better job, is not just going to conferences in our bubble, but engaging with the communities. Especially, I had the privilege recently to present my work to 8th and 12th graders at a California school. And they were excited and sent me handwritten letters, multiple pages of thank you for firstly empowering us to know that we matter. We have a voice. We can make a fundamental change. We don't need adults to do it, because they don't. But that also history can be alive. History can be challenging, it can be frustrating, but it can be empowering. Right? And it's that's the world to me. And so I think as academics, if you'd asked me 3 years ago, 5 years, I would have been whatever. That's not where my goals are. But I think now, that's where my passion is. And so talking with Emmanuel about, hey, if you want me to come do a talk of yours, I'm down. Because that is more impactful to me. Because if it leads to someone in the audience saying, hey, just so you know, insert some story about my family. And I go, well, it looks like I got my next book. Or you want to write it together? I'm trying to write something in collaboration with Michelle. I want her to have full front, I'll do the legwork so that way she knows, because she was even fighting with her own family. Her own family told her, move on. No one cares about our history, and it's too hard. It's too painful. And I said, if it takes me telling your family that your history matters, and I actually recorded a personal message to her family, where I said that to them to be look, you matter. That's important, is I think as academics, we need to do a better job of that, but also sincere allyship, not just oh, it's February, so let's do Black History. Black History all day, every day. Women's History all day, every, right? Like insert history. We don't need to wait for the occasion to do something that matters. And the fact that I'm here because of the conversations that were had, but you know, I was here a year and a half ago and now I'm back, and it led to what y'all are doing. Like, this is more meaningful to me than a lot of other things, because I just think what matters more is about getting people to feel empowered and to move beyond. I'm not dismissing Lincoln and all the prominent individuals, they matter. But what about your descendants too? Ignoring their contributions to history, to me, is disrespectful and dismisses everything that they fought and that we, myself included, take for granted every second of every day. Because I can vividly remember my great-grandfather, born in 1901, talking about like owning a juke joint, which I was like, so what? You know, being run out of Georgia by the Klan. You know, like seeing Hank Aaron hit that home run. He was a Braves fan. Right, and it's just like that, like those kind of moments, and asking, what was it like to see a TV? Right, like, oh, what was it like to see color TV? Right, like those kinds of things, and to get his perspective, to me, was illuminating, and it made me put more respect on my own family.
So along those lines, how can people learn more about the USCT?
So I will give a cheap plug for my book. All right, look, I would love if you buy it. But you know, for me, truthfully, like I want it in public libraries. Like if at minimum, if you have access to a public library card, get it there. But in the back of the book is a method section. So I literally break down how did I do the research, because I want someone else to be able to find it. And to be clear, even though I'm researching African American soldiers and their families, you can use those methods to apply it anywhere. I did a presentation in the UK, and someone who's doing Irish history in World War II, I think, was like, I'm gonna use that method. I was like, wait, what? So like, for me, it's like, first of all, Ancestry, I get no plugs for this stuff. Ancestry.com, Fold 3, even though I have a lot of frustration with Fold 3. Civil War pension records are, I wanna say, they're a crapshoot. You never know what you're gonna get. I have one that is 3 pages and one that is 800 pages. But I will say this, one of the things that I found in there, which I still cannot believe and totally spoils my book, which I would get, is that I had a handwritten letter from the desk of Eleanor Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression, having a correspondence with a USCT's daughter. And what she is writing, and says, I'm paraphrasing, in the grand scheme of what's happening in the world, I know I don't matter, but you and your husband have done so much for the United States and for Black people. Will you please look into my mother's widow's pension case, because she is dying of cancer. Eleanor not only responds to this woman, and they have a discourse that goes for a long time. She goes to what becomes a VA and says, you're gonna look into this case, not tomorrow, not next week, not next year. I want an answer today to my satisfaction. I can't get people to answer email in 2 weeks. And the First Lady does that. And to me, it's like, looking at that record was that daughter saying, do not forget what my family gave this country. And the First Lady did not forget. I won't spoil how it ends, but it was powerful to me.
I'm sorry, I was so caught up.
I was getting I had to close myself.
Much better First Lady than Julia Gardner. Oh, where can we find more information? Okay, so you know, there is now a lot more books, if you're into books. Some of the issues with books is when they're published by academic presses, they cost a little bit more money. And lately, we've been having issues in the world of the publishing and even getting the paper to print the words on. So a book that I contributed an essay to was supposed to come out like 2.5 years ago, and it's coming out this December, I believe. So
Which book? Get a plug. Which one?
Yeah.
Come on now.
It's a book about sort of the connections between the Civil War in the summer of 2020, is what it is. And my essay is about the attack on Black people wearing clothing. So it looks at a comparison of use of U.S. colored troops and their uniforms, and the attacks on U.S. colored troops and veterans who were still wearing their uniforms, compared with modern Black people who were wearing Black Lives Matter attire. I think it was good. I heard from someone else that it was good.
I was one of the readers. It's good. It's really
Anyway, Fordham University Press if you're interested, but go to historic sites, and if you do not hear the stories, it's responsibility on us to ask the story, where is the information? And so there are some places that you might be surprised about that are like doing this history now, like the John and Mary Surratt House in Maryland. If you don't know, Mary Surratt was implicated in the Lincoln assassination. For a long time, it's been kind of like, poor Mary, the first woman the United States executes. But now they're like moving on beyond that, and including stories of the enslaved people who lived and worked at that site, including a couple who ended up serving where I work now in Petersburg during the war. We have new national park sites still at Camp Nelson and National Park out in Kentucky, which is one of the few USCT recruitment camps that has not been developed. There are tons of blogs out there, some good, some not. You usually can tell the better ones because they will give you sources. Mine is very neglected. People find it out there, but I haven't posted in years. I really feel like nowadays, especially in the NPS world, not to get into NPS issues, but we are not the most well-funded agency in government, so we don't have as many people as I think many other people would like to see us have to talk to the public. So you may catch us recording information on waysides in the park. If you're going around and you're like, I'm still not seeing it, go to the visitor center, write a letter to the park superintendent. Try not to write to your congressperson first. But you can. We can't deny you that. Make the demand, and you will start to see it come in.
Well, thank you both. Now, if anyone in the audience has questions, hands up quickly. All right.
This is just an anecdote talking about writing history. We read, because I'm in my 70s, so this happened quite a while ago in Richmond, but we read the autobiography of Chuck Richardson. And it was, I can't say it was the most well-written book, he probably did it himself, but the history in there, it's a transition of the white city government to the more equal Black city government, and what he went through, and what it was like, and he spent 2 chapters on his history in Vietnam, and that is another eye-opening thing. So I just want to say that the written word and the sharing, and it is in the Richmond Public Library, that's how we got it. So, but to Emmanuel,
Yes.
I grew up in the area that you did.
Oh yeah, Dinwiddie County.
And just in the area. I don't tell people where. It's embarrassing, but I went to high school there, and it was racist back then, and in pockets it's still as racist as it's ever been. To where I can't even go to sometimes lunches with my classmates from so long ago. How did you ever get your work done and get support for it? I know you had to be resilient, but there's got to be some real gut-wrenching stories.
Of course. I'll share this. I worked with someone who routinely would say, not to me. I guess wanting to avoid a showdown with the Scorpio, which I always caution everyone probably not to do. And I'm an October Scorpio, and November Scorpios are something different. It's like mellow out. They behind my back, they would say to other people, well, Emmanuel wants to, we have this one plantation site at our grants headquarters at City Point Unit that I wanted to change the story there to not one about Ulysses Grant and his military prowess defeating Robert E. Lee, or Abraham Lincoln's 2 visits there, but one about slavery and emancipation. And since this person has never said anything to me, I have never, dealt with it head on. It's always come to me secondhand. But it's like, there is no reason for Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln to come to this little podunk place known as City Point, Virginia, had it not been for slavery. It wasn't a vacation spot. There was no great hotels there to check out. There was slavery. There was slavery there and countless other places across this country that even as 2 people who may not have been necessarily motivated in 1861 by emancipation, by 1865, when we're both there for 2 of the last 3 weeks of Abraham Lincoln's life, during his visits there, reviewing armed black men, which had been illegal in this country since 1793 Militia Act, that it is because of slavery and emancipation that the 2 of them are there. And they are there in part because the enslaved people in this little podunk back place, now Hopewell, Virginia, escaped out of slavery. So, I have faced the resistance. I just keep going because I have had more people than I was into the library today in Hopewell to rent, or not rent, but to ask if they had a room. We have a meeting in later this summer, and the woman at the desk, she said, I know you work over down the street at City Point. And I was like, yes. And she said, you've been there a long time, haven't you? And I said, just 22 years. And she said, well, my daughter came to visit me, and she lives in Florida. And she said, this was years ago, and I have no memory of seeing this lady. There's thousands of people I've seen over the years. And she said, my daughter and I had such a great time learning about this site. We are from here, and we learned so much from you about the place. And so the resistance among coworkers or others pales in comparison to a folder of letters from the public. These, comments on the street. I live where I work. And so I see people at the barbershop, at the grocery store, and the appreciation is more than the resistance. And so that's what keeps me going.
It makes it worth it. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So, beyond valor, so what can you tell us about USCT Medal of Honor recipients during the American Civil War? And how deep is your work on that?
Mine has not been on that. Having said that, I could see something that I might touch on for my second book, but I'm technically working on 2 books at once. I need a hobby. And one of them is going to be focusing on all Black Pennsylvanians who trained at Camp William Penn. So I'm going to argue that they are demanding inclusion in the national family and talk about whatever. And so, if I recall off the top of my head, I think at least 2 of the Black Pennsylvanian soldiers, not of the first 3 regiments that I studied, were Medal of Honor recipients. More could be done on that, to be honest. If you were in my class, I'd say that's a dissertation. But not for real, or that's a book. It's a book that's sorely needed because, dang, you just got my brain rolling on that one. Can you think of a article that comes to mind that really goes into that?
I can think of one. I'll shout out Richmond National Battlefield, my friends up the road. And I guess where we are now, from Petersburg, just outside. On the Richmond National Battlefield website, they have a section of the website about the Medal of Honor recipients from the Battle of New Market Heights. There is a organization, I see Tim Talbot here in the room, who is very involved with the Battle of Newmarket Heights sort of remembrance, preservation. Newmarket Heights is sort of still largely inaccessible to the public on a day-to-day basis, though over the last 15 or so years, the American Battlefield Trust now has been preserving land. Henrico County has preserved some land, and there's always a little bit more to do. There is a book about Battle of Newmarket Heights. The Black Medal of Honor recipients in the country's history is now represented in the military section. I will say the very small military section at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or as me and some of my friends refer to it, Blacksonian. So the ones that have photos up on the wall, those who don't are represented just with the Medal of Honor. But yes, more to be done on that, and just will say that one of the Medal of Honor recipients, Powhatan Beatty, was born here in Virginia, nearby in Henrico, and post-Civil War became a Shakespearean actor. And so, I was reading a newspaper article about a friend, historian, archivist, Dr. Lucius Edwards, who was at Virginia State University down in Petersburg before he retired. He was in the Petersburg paper this week, and he said when he was a kid, he didn't have people talking to him about what Black people could do, but he always knew that Black people could do more than what was represented in media at the time, which was being a maid or a butler. And I think Beatty sort of shows, like, we don't often think Black Shakespeare actor. You can be like Black funny actor, you can be Black maid, butler, actor. You don't think Shakespearean actor. And so we sort of limit ourselves sometimes in what we think, and there's a Medal of Honor recipient who did great things on and off the battlefield.
Your passion, the two of you, your passion is palpable, and I know you must realize that you've been called to this work. You feel it too, right?
And anybody on this side, because I haven't gotten to this side yet.
Okay, let me ask my question though.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Janine, go ahead.
And you've been talking about your writing, your books, and your next book, and your next book. I'm glad, Kelly, that you asked the question about change that they may have seen via the work. But in this day of people like Ron DeSantis and
I knew that was coming.
as you shine your light into the abyss of ignorance, what challenges have you faced or do you anticipate? Because like you said, the Civil War is all about the other side. Because it wasn't about slavery, so therefore.
So I can actually answer this with something that recently happened. So I went to the University of Central Florida. Like, I lived most of my life in the state of Florida. So I'm always aware of what Florida man is doing. And so recently I was invited by the University of Central Florida in connection with the Veterans Legacy Project to present my work to secondary school teachers throughout the state of Florida, most of them 3rd through 6th grade teachers. And first of all, because I was crying, they started crying. And one of the things they asked me was like, how do we navigate teaching all this? And I just was like, look, first and foremost, I know that I'm talking about what I do from a place of privilege at a private school where, like, Lindsey Graham could go to war with me on Fox News. I'm not getting fired. But if I was at Clemson, I'm fired. And I know that, right? And so I told them, like, I don't have all the answers, but at minimum how you can, like I've been trying to say to you, not to move beyond talking about Blackness, but that I'm just talking at the end of the day about military families. So if you don't like military families, you want to have that conversation? And usually once I go that route and start talking about pensions, I'm like, okay, so if you don't like pensions, you don't like the first federally funded social welfare program in the United States going back to the Revolution, so you don't really like veterans, do you? So there's a part of me that I would have it on a plaque if I was banned in like Ron DeSantis, because I'd be like, oh, this is perfect. But it's like, having said that, I'm not out there with those teachers doing, because the horrors of what they were telling me, I can't even begin to describe you how scared they are.
Right.
I mean, and it's real, and we need to acknowledge that. We need to pay teachers better. We need to protect these people and everyone that goes to those schools better. That's a whole different thing, but they are scared. And for me, it was just like, don't lose your job, number one. And because they were like, I feel like every time I'm teaching, I'm teaching from a place of, am I gonna get fired? That was a common statement that a lot of them made. I'm afraid what I'm gonna say is gonna get fired. And so for me, it was like, if you talk, in my opinion, if you talk about it, one, from a state of passion, like that you believe in what you're teaching, that this is not just interesting, but like, this is important, and insert why, for you. But then also that you can't teach scared. Historically, even if we were going to talk about the state of Indiana when the Women's Ku Klux Klan was running the school boards, I mean, like that's the sad part as a historian. Like, other than technological advances, there's very few things that surprise me. And so the history of just discrimination and the battles over public schools is long. And Pennsylvania, Philadelphia has a history that goes back to the 1800s in some instances. I think for me, it's just trying to emphasize to these teachers that I see you. And especially since I've been invited to present to 8th graders in California and their students are demanding it, because I'm gonna keep it real from an academic perspective. The kids wanna have these conversations. Let me say this one more time. The kids wanna have these conversations. We're too scared to. I'm not, but a lot of people are. But they want to. In fact, at Furman, one of my students, and I was hiding in the bushes because I did not want her to put me out, was like did a demonstration with the branch of the NAACP at Furman, using the content from my class and other classes to talk about how the school could do a better job about being more inclusive and not just a tokenized way. Right, so it's like these students, I promise you, go to these different sites, they hear this information and they take it. Right, like even we talk about Rosa Parks, but as I learned, having the privilege of sitting in the audience, hearing Fred Gray saying that not like before that I think it was 3 or 4 young black girls who had just went to a Black History Month presentation, did a sit-in on public transit, but the local community wasn't ready. So we don't talk about that. The kids they want this, and in my opinion, from what they expressed to me, they're usually more upset that why did I have to come to this school, or why did I have to come to this site, or why did I have to come to this event to hear this? So we need to be more comfortable in embracing that they want to have the hard conversations. We don't.
Right, well, thank you for that. And one last, right over there.
All right, I'm gonna ask a question first and then I'll explain why. And I'm like, I want you guys to give us some homework for something that we can do. Emmanuel, I had the pleasure and privilege of hearing you speak at the Sesquicentennial 10 years ago. And what I came down from up north where I lived at the time, one of the things that struck me was we had great presence from the military days at the time there. We had a lot of people who weren't quite sure that the South really lost the war at the event. And I sort of felt like there were very few other people there. There were some amazing USCT living historians who were descendants of them. And I was taken aback as a Northerner back then that there weren't enough people there to hear the story. So what homework can those of us here do to help get this story out? This is a story that's been on my radar because my ancestors were the illiterate Irish that marched in with Burnside and the USCTs into the wilderness. So I've been aware of the USCTs. But again, what homework can we do to get this story out? Because I'm still traumatized from 10 years ago about these amazing people being there and not having an audience to speak to.
So it is, I'm glad that you asked that. So whatever stories that we've shared here tonight, I would say go back and tell somebody that wasn't here.
Facts.
So, if you're struck by the pension battle, and there are lots of battles, Elizabeth and Susan's were not the only one, but go tell that story.
Yes.
If you're interested in George Hatton becoming a minister, you can sort of findagrave.com, it's free, you can read more about him there. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, go to Arlington, visit his grave. You're upset that it seems like there's not enough people when you go to your next Civil War park visit or museum or talk. Tell your neighbor, tell a family member, get in the car, going with me. And as I said, when you're at the site and you're like, why am I not hearing about all the people that I know were here? You should say to the people who work there, why am I not hearing about all the people who lived or fought in case of a war or died? You're at a cemetery or whatever. Whatever the site is, you know that there's more than one narrative. What is it? Why am I not hearing it?